This summer, APA Ohio is bringing together Ohio State legislators, planners, and allies to share stories about the impact of planning. Join us in your region for legislative updates and an opportunity to connect on one of the profession's top priorities, housing. These events are free and open to all APA Ohio members, planners, allies, and elected and appointed officials across the state of Ohio. For more details and to RSVP, visit ohioplanning.org/advocacy days. Today's webinar will give a brief overview of housing legislation in Ohio and efforts to prepare our attendees for the coming gatherings. More information on our specific key asks around housing in Ohio that will be presented at these events will be emailed ahead of each gathering. Be sure to visit the links in the description of this webinar recording for supplemental reading material.
Thanks, Chris, for the opportunity to talk about all the exciting things that are going on in the state of Ohio as it relates to housing. My name is Jeff Mills. I'm the Director of Development for a company called Penrose, and I serve on the APA Ohio Board of Trustees. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Jason Warner. I'll have Jason introduce himself, but there is no better subject matter expert, I think, in the state on these issues than Jason. So we're in for a treat. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. No, I appreciate that, Jeff. My name is Jason Warner. I am the Director of Strategic Engagement at the Greater Ohio Policy Center. We are a statewide nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy association that focuses on smart growth and revitalization efforts around the state of Ohio. And for a little more than a year now, I have been working with the APA Policy Committee, advising on legislative issues that are pending at the Ohio State House. So it is great for me to be here this afternoon to talk a little bit more about some of the exciting things that have been happening right now at the State House.
That's awesome. Jason, the way that this ties into the work that APA Ohio is doing is, we've been putting a lot of effort into advocating for planners and for planning, right? We feel like planning in the state of Ohio is something that we needs a greater voice and can lead to better outcomes for our communities. And that is why we have had this partnership with you and your organization. That's also why we're hosting a series of planner advocacy days around the state of Ohio. There's going to be 5 of these coming up. It's an opportunity for planners and allied professionals to meet and interact with state legislators to affect change. There are changes that could be beneficial to the state, and we're here to give voice to planners and planning here in Ohio. With that as sort of an introduction, I want to jump into the sort of meat of it. Jason, there's been so much work done around the topic of housing in Ohio, specifically recently with the Senate Select Committee on Housing. And I think that might be a good place to start. Do you want to give us a little background on what that committee is, what their work has been, and maybe what some of the outcomes have been?
Sure. So to go back a little bit, last year during the budget, the legislature approved a number of new funding mechanisms that were intended to help to spur housing development in the state of Ohio. There has been a lot of discussion about the fact that we are sort of at a crisis point right now when it comes to development of affordable housing throughout the state of Ohio. And there were at least 3 programs that I can think of that were created in the state budget, including the state low-income housing tax credit program, the new Welcome Home Ohio program, and an affordable single-family housing development program, all of which the legislature appropriated significant funds to help spur housing development in the state. Well, there was a recognition on the part of lawmakers that just putting money towards the problem is not going to be enough. So the Senate formed the Senate Select Committee that the intent was to go around the state, hear from local experts, hear from folks on the ground exactly what challenges their communities are facing on an everyday basis when it comes to the challenge of developing affordable housing in their communities. So the Senate Select Committee began hearings late last summer in Columbus, and then went around the state throughout the fall and early winter of 2023 and 2024, taking testimony, hearing about the challenges that communities are facing. And Jeff, for example, I know that you were among those who appeared at the field hearing that they held in Cincinnati, trying to get a better sense of what communities needed from the state to help them to spur greater development and really to fast track some of the processes that are already ongoing to try to develop affordable housing around the state of Ohio. The Senate Select Committee then published a full report of all of the summary of the hearings, the testimony that they had heard from experts around the state, and provided 23 recommendations to lawmakers that they felt needed to be acted upon in order to help to spur housing development. These varied from very technical recommendations, things that state agencies could be doing to make information more accessible to communities and developers, but it also included very specific recommendations around a range of issues, most notably being zoning.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's huge. And so this report was published. It's a very long, it's a very lengthy report. It includes summaries of all of the field hearings that were held and outcomes from those. And then it has, as you mentioned, the 23 recommendations. And that is and then there's this sort of big release of the report and great fanfare. And so now what? so we've got all these recommendations. What happens next?
Yeah, so what I think is very encouraging is that quite often these blue ribbon task force or these select committees are appointed, and there's a great deal of fanfare about the creation of the committee, and then they submit the report. And I think a lot of us are sort of jaded to the fact that what usually happens then is it just sits on a shelf and collects dust, and 5-10 years from now are like, oh, we should probably do something about this. And then there's another committee or blue ribbon task force that comes about. To the credit of the Senate Select Committee, they have actually taken those recommendations, and to date, there have already been at least 5 pieces of legislation that have been introduced based upon the recommendations that were part of the final report of the Senate Select Committee. Now, some of them are placeholder bills. I mentioned, zoning reform was among the topics that the Senate Select Committee recommended. There's a placeholder bill that has been introduced. It says nothing more than it's the intent of the General Assembly to introduce legislation to address the issue of zoning reform in communities around the state of Ohio. No other language beyond that. Some of the proposals, however, are much more technical. Give me a moment here. I'm trying to remember the specific bill numbers. There have been a few. Senate Bill 245 is a very good example of this. And what Senate Bill 245 does is it includes a number of changes to state housing law, including a provision that would require providing legal assistance to low-income renters who are facing a potential eviction. It also makes changes to state building code enforcement and disclosure requirements around who owns a rental property to make it easier for code enforcement as well as for those who are renting to know who they can address their concerns to. So that's just one example of some of the bills that the legislature, that the Senate has introduced, and that they've already been holding hearings on. Several of these bills have had as many as 3 hearings from the time that they were introduced in late April through the end of the spring legislative session, which just wrapped up last month. And we're anticipating that those hearings are going to continue into the fall and the lame duck session, which is scheduled to take place after this November's election, all of which is basically teeing these bills up. It's very unlikely that any of these bills will be passed before the end of this year, but it's teeing up this conversation for when the new legislature takes session in January of next year. And we anticipate that a lot of these bills will be part of the budget discussion that kicks off in January of 2025.
That's awesome. And one very important piece to any legislation is will there be additional resources for planners in Ohio to do things like zoning reform, or even better, to do planning before the implementation of a zoning change?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and separate from the work that has been going on with the Senate Select Committee and the legislation that they introduced. There have been a number of bills that are pending in both the House and the Senate that are dealing with housing and zoning reform. And one bill in particular that your members will want to keep an eye on is House Bill 315, which was passed at the end of the June legislative session by the House, is now pending over in the Ohio Senate. And technically, the bill was introduced to do some updates to general township law. But through the course of the bill being heard over in the Ohio House, they added funding into the legislation that would provide assistance to local communities to assist with zoning reform efforts that are either currently underway or may be undertaken by local communities to update their zoning codes to better reflect some of the ongoing needs that communities need, particularly around the issues of housing. And that would be available to any community. It's not just restricted to townships. And the most important piece of this is that there is a component of technical assistance that will be able to be provided to these local communities who may just be getting this process started. A lot of communities haven't updated their zoning codes in 50, 60 years. There's probably a great deal of unknown about how exactly we go about this process. And having that financial assistance available to communities to be able to provide that, get that work started, would be a huge help for any number of communities around the state.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And this is where, our membership comes in, right? Our state legislators need to hear how important this is to our communities, right? I joke, I'm in the housing industry, and I joke all the time that so many places housing is illegal. We need to legalize housing through our zoning, and so it has to be done smart. It has to be done in the right places. Of course, we're not at odds with smart growth principles and eating up farmland for housing, but there is a way to marry all of the needs together, and that's the planning process, and that's what our members do every day. So that is why we're having these advocacy days to give legislators an opportunity to hear from the boots on the ground, the people that are engaging with residents in communities and hearing the needs, and then hopefully coming up with better tools to guide land use and hopefully allow for additional housing production across the state. I have an opportunity often to give presentations on affordable housing, but I always start these conversations with, we need housing in Ohio, like of all kinds, affordable, market rate, and we need it quick because the price pressures that people are facing when it comes to their housing are just tremendous, and it really impacts economic development. It impacts community development, and it's a big deal. So I would encourage all of our members to and I'm sure that Chris Dursey Davis, our executive director, will be sharing the dates of each of those 5 policy advocacy days, and so there's an opportunity to get engaged that way. Jason, one more question. And was the House bill that you just referenced, was that the one that was introduced by Representative Isaacson?
So there was actually another piece of legislation that Representative Isaacson is working on. It's a joint sponsored bill with Representative Isaacson, a Democrat from Cincinnati, and Representative Adam Matthews, who is a Republican from suburban Warren County, just to the north of Cincinnati. And that bill includes a number of housing related reform measures that local communities could decide to take advantage of, zoning reform being one of those pieces that communities could implement. And it basically, the bill sets up a structure where if communities take these pro-housing steps to implement within their local communities, there would then be financial incentives that they would be able to receive from the state to help to support that new housing development that will be going on in their local communities. That is House Bill 499. It is currently pending right now over in the House Government Oversight Committee. It had its third hearing most recently on June 11th. And that's a piece of legislation. It was introduced almost concurrent with the publication of the Senate Select Committee's report. And we're anticipating that that's legislation that's going to continue to receive hearings throughout the fall and very much could be front and center in budget discussions when those kick off next January.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, when I read that that piece of legislation, what struck me was there was a menu of options that a community could choose if they wanted to engage with and to do. And if they did a certain number of those, my dog is letting me know that he likes this idea. Then they could start to get resources for development in their community. And what I saw was I used to be a township administrator, and I lived through the winnowing down of the local government fund and state support for local initiatives. I saw this as an opportunity to actually get more resources at the local level from the state. So I thought that was a really interesting concept that those two representatives had put forward, and I like the fact that it's bipartisan too. That's pretty great.
It's great to see that that members are working across the aisle, because this really is a nonpartisan issue. And what is wonderful about legislation like House Bill 499 is that it's not mandating anything that cities have to do. It's completely voluntary on the part of communities. If you want to choose to participate in this program, that's an option that you have that is available to you. And then it is also not dictating exactly what changes you have to do at the local level in order to qualify for this. It's giving you, as you mentioned, that menu of options. I think that there are something like 20 that are listed as part of the legislation, and you only have to implement, I think it's 8 in order to qualify. And if you implement 10 or more, there's like extra incentives that are available to you as well. But again, you're able to tailor what's the best fit for your community rather than having to do exactly what the legislature is saying. You have to do these things in order to qualify. It's completely voluntary. It's completely optional, and you're able to tailor what's best for your community through that.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Cool. Well, I mean, so really the takeaway here, Jason, is that there is this moment that exists right now that's pretty special, where a lot of eyes are on one issue that are affecting many of our communities. And so as from the perspective of APA Ohio's sort of legislative committee, we acknowledge that moment and are trying to lean into that and really effectuate some change and make our voices heard. So I don't know, were there any other topics that you wanted to go over, or is this a good place to put our final call to action?
All I will say is this, I don't think that there has been this much discussion among state lawmakers, among lawmakers anyway, about the urgent need of housing probably at any point in our state, probably since the end of World War II. And APA Ohio is in a very unique position to be able to offer expert insights to legislators who really, when they come into office in January, they're drinking from a fire hose. They have 5 budgets that they have to pass in the first 6 months of the year. This upcoming General Assembly in particular, is going to have something like 1/3 of the membership is going to be brand new. They've never served in the legislature. So APA Ohio being able to begin having those conversations with sitting lawmakers now to prep them and educate them about what the needs are for communities throughout the state of Ohio. It's a great time to be taking the opportunity to join these legislative meet and greets that are going to be taking place here over the next couple of months. I would encourage you to do that. Speak to the lawmakers. You have better insight about this than anyone probably could. And this is really going to be a once in a generation opportunity to have a meaningful impact on one of the most important issues that you'll ever discuss at the State House, which is for being able to provide quality housing for everyone.
Yeah, that is very well put. There's one more issue that you brought up, you mentioned, but I'd like to dig into a little bit more, and that is the state's creation of a state low-income housing tax credit. And my understanding is that that program has been authorized for 5 years, after which time, they'll reevaluate. So could you talk a little bit about that piece of legislation and its sort of timeline, and is that a topic that maybe planners should weigh in on as well?
Definitely. That is a program. It's being administered, as most of these housing programs are right now. It's being administered by the Ohio Department of Development. Yeah, we'll be able to.
OFA.
OFA. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. OFA,
Yep.
the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, is administering the state low-income housing tax credit. It's out there now. There are, of course, going to be a number of restrictions in place as to who qualifies, where those can be built, and everything like that. But yeah, you definitely are going to want to continue to have those conversations and work with the state agencies, work with state lawmakers to help to keep that program in place. We've obviously had a federal program that's been in place for a number of years. There have been at various times concerns that have been raised by lawmakers about that program. And obviously, whenever you talk about low-income housing in a lot of communities, that can be a hot button topic of discussion. But working with local communities, working with lawmakers, educating them about the importance of programs like this and why having this type of a program is a tremendous benefit for communities across the state of Ohio is a conversation that we're going to want to be having so that we can, even though this was authorized for a 5-year program, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to always be there. Even through the 5 years it was originally authored, they could very easily, from one General Assembly to another, decide, maybe this isn't as important as we thought it was, or there were hiccups within the program that we should be phasing it out. Having conversations, educating lawmakers about those needs, and making sure that you're taking advantage of it while it's there is of critical importance, I think, for communities throughout the state.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. My understanding, my perspective is that they've authorized up to $100 million of tax credits per year. I've noticed that the market for those tax credits is this year, in its first year, is about 55 cents on the dollar. So essentially, that's gonna generate $55 million of sources for the production of affordable housing. And it's interesting, you mentioned the name low income housing tax credits is something of a misnomer, and I think that it's a myth that needs to be busted. It looks different in each geography of the state, but here in Cincinnati, for example, an individual could be making $40,000 and qualify for low-income housing tax credit. And what we're talking about are our service workers. We're talking about our daycare workers. We're talking about the people that mean a lot in my life, as I have young kids and rely on folks that get paid, within the range that qualifies for high quality, affordable housing. That is a very interesting topic, and one that we should keep on our radar. Well, I think that should do it. That should wrap it up. As a final call to action, reach out, stay tuned to LinkedIn and all your social media outlets to learn more about our housing, or excuse me, our policy advocacy days that are coming up in different parts of the state. We'd love to see you at one or more, and thanks for all that you do, Jason, and thanks for all that our audience of planners does every day for communities around the state.
Thank you both, Jeff and Jason.